The troopship Empire Windrush brought significant numbers of African Caribbean people to Britain in 1948. A call went out to the British colonies for workers to help rebuild Britain following the destruction and privations of the war with Hitler. Most black people today wouldn't remember this, were it not for the Conservative government's policy of creating a toxic, hostile environment for immigrants to the UK. Many came here to help rebuild the UK, and they came from British territory, so were British citizens at the time of arrival. None of this mattered to the Home Secretary, Theresa May, who used every trick available to deport as many as possible, despite their contributions to the UK and their continued service, spending their entire working life here. It took continued pressure from Caribbean governments, the media, MPs and community groups to get the government to accept this as wrong and to begin reparations. Almost 70 years after the event. The Windrush scandal, as it became known, has dominated black political activity in the UK, but not always in a positive way. There are Windrush community groups, Windrush events and festivals, even non-Windrush organisations such as carnivals now dedicate their events to Windrush. Publications abound with increasingly pro-British sentiments. Is this the latest example of what many call the Stockholm Syndrome? A condition where the oppressed form strong bonds with their oppressor. It's titled after an event in Stockholm, Sweden in 1973, when a failed bank robbery resulted in hostages being held in a siege that lasted for almost a week. Following their release, the hostages refused to testify against the robbers and even helped in their defense. We have already seen how freed slaves in the Americas joined with Europeans, purchasing their own slaves and establishing their own plantations. Plantations in the Americas were funded by black investors living in Britain. Maroon communities, and if you're not sure Maroon communities are, then see the video on the abolitionists. Maroon communities helped European military forces to put down slave rebellions. African peoples fought with European armies against African independence movements in the latter half of the 20th century, and civil rights leaders in the USA, after fighting for their freedom, supported the government in helping European nations to fight against the freedom of people in Africa. There are many more examples of black people helping their oppressors to maintain their oppression. Now, regarding Windrush, thousands of African Caribbean people left the Caribbean to help their former slaving and current colonizing masters to rebuild. This was despite the fact that many Caribbean nations were in a much worse state because their so-called mother country was draining their resources and had greatly weakened their infrastructure after years and years of exploitative control. Windrush could be seen as a skill drain on the Caribbean. Windrush appears to have given the history of the presence of African peoples in the UK a whole new starting point. I mean, I've seen too many articles documenting the history of African peoples in the UK that begin with Windrush. I mean, this is despite the fact that the Empire Windrush wasn't even the first troop ship to bring people from the Caribbean to Britain. At least two other ships, the SS Ormond and the SS Almanzora, arrived the year before. Indeed, African peoples have been on this island since the Romans invaded in the 1st century of the Common Era. The Romans arrived with legions and nobles from their colonies in North Africa, and many Africans decided to settle here. And as early as the 16th century, Queen Elizabeth I suffered appeals from senior politicians and merchants concerned about the size of the African population in Britain, actually requesting the removal of these blackamoors. The response to Windrush resembles the reactions to the Black Lives Matter movement, as in knee-jerk responses to long-standing issues, only recently discovered via the media. Now, these very quickly became slogans, political platitudes, rhetorical statements, and action for social media platforms. Windrush activity has moved from protest to celebration, with festivals and entertainment becoming the norm. The true significance of Windrush is as an example of the systemic unfair discrimination against African people and how, even in the 21st century, it still influences the policies of governments. Unfortunately, this now appears to be second to British nationalism. Windrush appears to be more about celebrating the importance of being accepted as British and our pride in being British than anything else. Following the scandal and the rise of Windrush fever, British politics did not become more tolerant and inclusive. Instead, it moved further to the right, with immigration being a major issue still. We saw Brexit, then the election of a Prime Minister who once published an article suggesting that European nations should invade Africa and recolonize it. Perhaps the only real change is that the proud British citizens who believe that our border should be protected and immigrants be treated in a hostile fashion are now just as likely to be black as white. And the same can be said of far-right politicians who thrive on xenophobia and play down or even celebrate racism. As one Windrush survivor proudly put it, we put the great in Britain. Unfortunately, behind every great nation, there are oppressed others.